How can the Belarusian factor affect the course of the Russian-Ukrainian war? Both the geographical position and regional advantages of Belarus are important for Russia. It is enough to take a brief look at the map to understand the special position of Belarus. To the west of Belarus are NATO members Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. The country borders Ukraine in the south and Russia in the east. The Belarusian border is located only 225 kilometers from the capital of Ukraine, Kiev. Therefore, the location of Belarus on the map is among the important factors affecting the Ukrainian war. In addition, Belarus is Moscow's only ally in Eastern Europe. Let's take a closer look at what happened in the Belarus-Russia-Ukraine triangle. As it is known, in the first stage of the Ukraine war, Russia invaded Ukraine from Belarus. However, the invasion attempt failed. Russian forces were redeployed to eastern Ukraine within weeks. Disturbed by this close relationship between Russia and Belarus, Ukraine began to take a series of measures. Ukrainian armed forces conducted intense exercises near the Belarusian border as they prepared for a spring pushback on Vladimir Putin's army. Exercise videos were shared on social media platforms. The training videos emerged as Russia continued to suffer heavy losses by the Kiev forces. The exercise is focused on training soldiers for offensive actions and improving their mental toughness by imitating real combat conditions. Ukrainian soldiers are trained to clear buildings, bypass obstacles, and attack enemy positions. Maxim Balovatsky, head of the Ukraine Support Forces group, said in a video of the training exercises that were doing an exact imitation of the act of war. In the exercise videos published, it seemed that the soldiers support each other while they drill to enter the trenches and defend their shelters. More shots showed them taking cover and evacuating the wounded in realistic war simulation. The most important purpose of the exercises carried out by Ukraine is to work on the psychological resilience of the soldiers before any difficulties they may encounter in the war. In addition to the exercises, Ukraine is also watching the Belarusian border for an expected Russian attack. Ukraine is fortifying even the quietest part of its border with Belarus, signaling a long war ahead of Russian President Vladimir Putin amid reports that Russia is preparing to launch a major offensive. Ukrainian soldiers monitored the country's 1,000-kilometer border with Belarus, looking for signs of any military buildup on the opposite side. Ukrainian troops use reconnaissance aircraft several times a day to monitor the area. Ukrainian troops are watching the 1,000-kilometer border of swamps and forests for a possible surprise attack. The forested terrain in the northwest Volyn region makes it difficult for tanks to cross the border. This year's unusually mild winter and dams built by the local beaver population have also made the border area particularly muddy and swampy. However, this does not mean that infantrymen and saboteurs cannot cross on foot. For this reason, Ukrainian troops are walking along the border every day and watching what's happening. Ukraine is using this quiet area for the time being to train troops for the Eastern Front. Farther from the border in muddy fields beyond the forest, soldiers teach each other how to use heavy artillery, including a large piece of artillery that is something between a howitzer, a cannon, and a mortar. In short, by deploying soldiers to the border with Belarus, Ukraine both ensures border security and expands the training area of the soldiers. Ukrainian forces on the border with Belarus are blockading it. Our conclusion from talks with a few Ukrainian soldiers stationed in the Volyn region is that the soldiers will continue to fight bravely under all circumstances. Now we will share the views of some soldiers of the Ukrainian army about the war. For example, in a thick pine forest in western Ukraine, not far from the Kremlin's border with Belarus, a military engineer named Anton oversees a large underground construction site. Anton did not say how many soldiers the near-finished bunker would hold. A gray-haired soldier using the and call sign states that during one of his last patrols, he noticed something disturbing on the Belarusian side of the border. The gray-haired soldier states that he saw a man in military clothes digging fortifications and trenches. A soldier named Vadim is wiping some of the rusted bullets. After years in storage, he pulls out a felt-tip pen and writes a message on one of them. Biden, thanks for the guns. We need more. In addition, Vadim once again shows his determination by saying we will fight under any circumstances. As a result, the effects of the Ukraine war are about to cross borders. Due to the fact that Belarus is on the side of Russia, Ukraine strengthened its borders. Kiev has blockaded the Belarusian border. In another development, the Russian ambassador to Belarus said that amid simmering tensions between Russia and the West, Russian tactical nuclear weapons will be deployed close to Belarus borders with its NATO neighbors. However, the ambassador declined to give precise information on where the weapons would be deployed. Ambassador Boris Gryzlov's comment came after Vladimir Putin's latest statement on Russia's plans to deploy tactical nuclear weapons on its neighbor and allies' territory. The announcement marks the Russian leader's attempt to fend off the nuclear threat to deter the West from supporting Ukraine. Despite all the noise in Europe and the USA, Vladimir Putin is determined to deploy nuclear weapons. Putin stated that the construction of storage facilities for tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus will be completed by July 1st. Putin's plans are perhaps the most important development of the Russian-Belarusian rapprochement. It can be said that there are some reasons for Putin making such a statement and declaring his will to place nuclear tactical weapons on Belarusian soil. Russia, which could not achieve the desired success in Ukraine, where it's been fighting for more than a year, aims to intimidate with its nuclear power, trying to show that it has not worn out militarily and that it's made much stronger moves. He also stated that Russia is helping to modernize Belarusian warplanes to make them capable of carrying nuclear weapons. On the other hand, tactical nuclear weapons aimed at destroying enemy troops and weapons on the battlefield have a relatively short range and much lower efficiency than nuclear warheads mounted on long-range strategic missiles capable of destroying entire cities. Deployment of Russian tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus will bring them closer to potential targets in Ukraine and NATO members in Eastern and Central Europe. Another issue is that Russia openly stated that it will put aside the national sovereignty of Belarus and will start to implement its own policies and strategies on this country, which indicates that the integration process between Belarus and Russia has reached the final stage. Trying to intimidate NATO and the EU, Russia is trying to draw a border line through Belarus against NATO's enlargement efforts. It is clear that Russia, which sees Belarus as its outpost in this regard, is trying to convey the message that it's still the most influential actor in post-Soviet geographies. It seems quite meaningful in time that Russia, which has been waiting in ambush against Sweden and Finland's efforts to join NATO, has drawn a border with its nuclear tactical weapons and the green light for Finland. How can the Belarusian factor affect the course of the Russian-Ukrainian war? We can give an answer to the question we asked at the beginning of the video. In the light of the circumstances, the deployment of Russian tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus is a major move to escalate the war in Ukraine. Belarus can play a key role in escalating the war. If the frightening winds of the Ukrainian war ever change direction, these winds may blow towards Belarus. The Ukrainian-Russian war has severely affected the critical region in Eastern Europe, socioeconomically, militarily, and politically. The Russians' plans for Donbass and Crimea and the Ukrainians' efforts to regain their freedom increase the tension in the second year of the war, especially at the beginning of this week. Ukrainian forces reflected on their successful advances on the front lines. Mobility has increased in Mariupol and Melitopol, one of the most critical front lines of the Crimean Peninsula in the south of Ukraine and the Donetsk region in the east of the country. The reason for the rise in tension in Crimea is considered to be the airstrikes and counterattacks carried out by the Ukrainian army in the last week. You may remember that the Ukrainian armed forces have targeted Crimea many times in the last weeks. Tanku, Sevastopol, and Armyansk, located on the border with the Kherson region of the peninsula, were subjected to attacks by unmanned aerial vehicles of Ukrainian forces. As a result of these attacks, an atmosphere of fear and panic naturally arose in the peninsula. The Kremlin administration does not hide its intention to forcibly evacuate the peninsula against the possible attack of the Ukrainian army. In addition, the Russians in Crimea have already begun to leave against possible attacks and sabotage. The residents have already greatly increased their escape from the peninsula since the first days of February 2023. Now, as a result of the last striking attacks of the Ukrainian forces on the peninsula, the flight from Crimea has reached its peak, especially after the drone attacks on Sevastopol. The voyages of some Russian ships in the Black Sea were prevented. Today, however, news emerged that some additional flights have begun to be rescheduled in the peninsula. The resumption of mass escapes by the residents with some additional expeditions that began today has seriously stirred up the atmosphere in Crimea. The families and relatives of the Russian forces on the peninsula had been making preparations to flee from the Crimea for a long time. Those who were preparing to flee by selling their immovables and real estates started to fill the piers in Crimea again. The fact that all the ships docked at the pier were packed and the voyages were carried out at intervals last week was one of the clearest proofs that revealed the true face of the war on the peninsula. On the other hand, the Russian authorities in the peninsula began to hide the heavy losses of the war and to spread rhetoric that Crimea was protected against attacks in order to calm this panic atmosphere there and prevent the escape of the peninsula residents. Yes, the Russians had deployed most of the air defense systems in the southern regions of Ukraine to the Crimea, but despite all these security measures, the Ukrainian forces could repeatedly target the peninsula with drones. And even the purpose of some of the Ukrainian airstrikes on the peninsula was only to learn the location of the Russian air defense systems. For this reason, even though the Russians tried to move their air defense systems to Crimea intensively, this situation did not matter much as the Ukrainian forces knew the location of the most strategic defense systems in Crimea thanks to the UAV attacks they carried out. For this reason, the inhabitants of Crimea are doing their best to escape from the peninsula, especially before the anniversary of the war on February 24th. As a result, it is estimated that approximately 350,000 people fled from the peninsula, which has a population of 2.5 million. These include mostly Russians, but other ethnic populations are thought to have fled. While this figure is increasing day by day, the proxy Russian administration cannot do anything to stop the escape from the peninsula because the inhabitants of the peninsula received serious socio-economic injuries due to the war. The high prices of even the most basic needs in Crimea make it very difficult to make a living here. On the other hand, the most fundamental factor in the peak of the escapes from Crimea is the lack of life safety of the people living in the region. Attacks by Ukrainian forces are usually aimed at Russian military resources on the peninsula. However, the lives of civilians are also in danger as a result of the Russians' response to these attacks or attempts to shoot down Ukrainian UAVs. That's why nobody wants to stay in Crimea anymore. Of course, there is a small part of the peninsula that wants the Russians to continue the war. However, the main purpose of this war and pro-Russian support groups is considered to be the Russian administration's attempt to impose its aggressive war policies. This war strategy of the Russian administration, which does not care much about the record losses, has not changed since the first days. It's not surprising that the Russians, who lost about 180,000 soldiers in the war, put their citizens living in Crimea at risk. The Crimean Peninsula is not the only place where the severe effects of the Ukrainian war have been experienced due to the war. The city of Mariupol has started to become very active these days, just like the Crimea. If you remember, it was reported that the Russian positions in the village of Nikolskaya and a school were hit recently. These attacks carried out by the Ukrainian forces in Mariupol greatly affected other settlements as well as Nikolskaya, as the Russians took action to carry out retaliatory attacks and take precautions against these attacks. The tension in the city suddenly rose again. As reported, the Russian invaders strengthened their checkpoints at the entrances to Mariupol, sniper groups. In addition, many reinforcements of Russian infantry groups carried out serious attacks in the city. As a result, Russian aggression caused one of the greatest humanitarian disasters in Mariupol. As a result of the bombardment of the Russian forces, the city is now almost 90% destroyed. It was reported that more than half of Mariupol, which has a population of 450,000 people, left the city. Nearly 250,000 residents left the city on ships from the port of Mariupol, never to return. The clashes in the city, which was almost destroyed as a result of these escapes, began to calm down to a large extent. On the other hand, similar activities took place in the Zaporizhia region this week, with the explosions that took place in Berdyansk, which was temporarily seized. The region was reactivated after more than 100 Russian invaders were killed. With the increase in the panic environment, the Russians in this region began to leave Berdyansk due to possible attacks by the Ukrainian forces. As a result, the Ukrainian forces almost caused the Russians to make mass escapes on the southern front lines and in some parts of Donetsk. In this way, the Ukrainians who took control of the battlefield much more gained a great advantage before the anniversary of the war. On the other hand, at the beginning of this week, there was another striking situation that affected the war. A critical move came from the USA in this important time period when the escapes increased and the war began to show its true face much more. Biden visited Kiev, promised $500 million in new weapons aid to Ukraine. US President Joe Biden, who made a surprise visit to Kiev 4 days before the first year of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, gave the message to President Volodymyr Zelensky that Washington is with him until the end. Among the weapons Biden promised are artillery shells, anti-tank ammunition, and alarm systems against airstrikes. The U.S. president also promised to impose a series of additional sanctions on Russia. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky published the footage of the moment. He shook hands with U.S. President Biden, who gave a strong message of support to his country with his visit on his Telegram page. In a statement shared by Zelensky on a social media account, Joseph Biden welcomed to Kiev. "Your visit is a very important sign of support for all Ukrainians," he wrote. On the other hand, Biden, who made critical statements during his visit to Ukraine, said, "With my visit to Kiev, we reaffirm our unwavering commitment to Ukraine's democracy, sovereignty, and territorial integrity." When Putin launched his invasion about a year ago, he thought Ukraine was weak and the West was divided. He thought he could outlast us, but he was sorely mistaken. Biden, who said that the Ukrainians paid a great price and made great sacrifices, signaled that the support provided to the Ukrainians would continue with these statements. Biden's visit was kept secret for security reasons. When Zelensky and Biden left St. Michael's Cathedral, sirens were heard in Kiev. However, there was no news of an air attack or a missile hitting the city. Many streets in Kiev were closed to traffic this morning after the U.S. president's visit. The business in Kiev resumed as before. After Ukraine, Biden will travel to Poland today for a 3-day visit. After this critical visit, EU foreign ministers will meet in Brussels to discuss ammunition aid to Ukraine. Ukrainians increase the frequency and intensity of precision strikes on the Russian bases in the Zaporizhia region. If previously Ukrainians conducted around 10 strikes per week, then now they are conducting 10 strikes per day. The most destructive strikes happened in Mariupol today. Local residents reported hearing multiple explosions near the airfield. The footage indicates activation of the Russian air defense, and according to the unconfirmed reports, Russians shot down 1 out of 4 missiles. This is the second consecutive day of strikes because yesterday Ukrainians struck Mariupol with 2 Storm Shadow missiles. The target of this strike were two facilities on the territory of the Azovstal industrial complex. One facility was used for the residence of hundreds of troops, while another one was used as a warehouse for equipment. Today, more information became available, as some Russian sources expressed their discontent and critique of the Russian command for failure to adjust to the new realities of war. While mentioning the 250 special operators and Marines died in the aftermath of yesterday's strike, it was also mentioned that a week ago, Ukrainians destroyed more than 200 troops in a similar strike on the facilities near the airfield, so a bit higher than the initial Ukrainian estimates of 150 troops. The fact that just in these two consecutive strikes, Ukrainians managed to eliminate almost 500 troops made many Russian analysts convinced that a lot of local residents had been actively spying for an extensive period of time, which is why more counter-spying measures should be implemented as soon as possible. Another powerful storm shadow strike happened in Berdyansk. The explosion was seen from villages located more than 10 kilometers away from the shore. Some sources reported that the target of this strike became the recreational center. Kimki and other sources suggested that the target of the attack was the Azov cable factory. However, both versions agreed that Ukrainians were aiming at the areas of forces concentrations. Ukrainians are also still actively using HIMARS over the last several days. Ukrainians conducted at least 3 HIMARS strikes on the Russian military objects in and around Donetsk. The target of the most reconnaissance strike became a former institute that Russians were using for military purposes. The target of the second strike became the Twin Towers, or more precisely, anti-tank guided missile systems, electronic warfare systems and reconnaissance systems that were conveniently placed on the roof of these high-rise buildings. The target of the third strike became an ammunition depot for the Russian air defense systems near Mazapan. Other sources also reported that Ukrainian artillery crews are also striking the towns and cities closer to the contact line. Some Ukrainian fighters stated today that Hamas rockets also hit Russian objects in Nikolsky, Melitopol, and Tokmak. Ukrainians are conducting smaller strikes outside the borders of Ukraine since Ukrainians agreed not to use HIMARS and Storm Shadows to hit Russian territories for these purposes. Ukrainians are using various types of kamikaze drones. The first drone strike happened today in the Pskov region. 2 drones straight to attack an oil pipeline near Hiroshima. However, they missed it and hit the building of the regional administration. The second drone strike happened in that very region. 2 drones tried to attack an oil pumping facility on Mariupol, which is one of the biggest industrial objects in the region. This time the drones were much closer to the target, but still only hit a workshop instead of the oil facilities. The third drone strike happened in the Krasnodar region. 2 drones unsuccessfully tried to target one of the factories located on the northeastern part of the city. 3 more strikes happened today in the Belgorod region. Here, Ukrainians hit a thermal power plant in Belgorod, a small gas pipeline and electric grid in Shebekino, and even destroyed 2 officers that were traveling in a car too close to the border. Overall, it is clear that right now Ukrainians are focused on the areas of enemy forces concentrations, and at the moment there are primary targets at the headquarters of the most trained and prepared Russian forces such as pilots, Marines, and special operators. In parallel, Ukrainians are using their drones to hit distant critical supply line objects, in particular the ones that are related to fuel. Even though the drones do not have the same success rate as Storm Shadow missiles, since drones are cheap and can be launched frequently, Ukrainians managed to destroy up to 20 fuel-related facilities just over the last month. The continuation of this campaign ensures that Russians will accumulate a plethora of problems with manpower and supplies where there are supply lines and military objects are extremely vulnerable.